good morning from Washington, D.C. I'm Ramayad, Senior Director of the Africa Center here at the Atlantic Council. This is the first time we live stream from our new studios, and the Africa Center, it is also the Africa Center first event in 2025. We wanted to dedicate it to the Horn of Africa and its forgotten genocides, its fragile ceasefires, and its threatening tensions. The future of the world will cross this region too. It's been 10 years the Africa Center has launched a task force to monitor this so strategic region. More recently, after nearly 2 years of fighting and genocidal acts committed in Sudan, continued instability in Ethiopia, and questions about territorial integrity in Somalia, civilians in these countries remain caught in the middle of conflict, politics, and regional tension. Djibouti remains at the crossroads of global and regional powers competitions. To help us to better understand these high stakes, we have asked our senior fellow A.J. Hogan-Dorn here to moderate this conversation. A.J. is the former advisor of the U.S. Special Envoy to Sudan, Deputy Program Director for Africa at the International Crisis Group, after leading the Crisis Group's Horn of Africa project from Kenya. He was also a former sanctions expert with the United Nations Panel of Experts on Somalia and Sudan, a researcher for Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. We have invited the best experts of this region, and I would like to thank them for their presence, time, and expertise. Magdi Amin, adjunct faculty, Johns Hopkins University, and managing partner of African Renaissance Ventures. Laurent Bloch-Blanchard, specialist in African affairs at the Congressional Research Service. Alan Boswell, project director for the Horn of Africa at International Crisis Group, who will speak from Kenya. Holod Kher, founder and director of Confluence Advisory, and Michael Waldemariam, associate professor at University of Maryland. EJ, over to you.
Thank you, Rama. It's a pleasure and an honor to be speaking here with this panel. Hopefully this will be an interesting conversation that will start our discussions around what we can do to help this very unstable region and focus a little bit more attention back to what's happening there. Without further ado, let me just start and ask Dr. Michael Waldemariam to kind of set the scene a little bit. You've been studying and teaching courses on the Horn of Africa for some time. What do you think are the major political and security trends in the region, and what do you believe is its current trajectory?
Thanks, EJ, for the question, and thanks to the Atlantic Council for hosting this event. Look, I mean, I don't, it's not my preference to be gloomy about the region, about its trajectory, but I think to level set it, we have to be candid about the fact that regional trends, I think, are quite worrying and have been worrying for some time. And I think there are a number of different trends that are intersecting to produce a level of regional instability that really we haven't seen for quite some time. So I think one big issue, I think, to note is the fact that most of the region's states are in some form of pretty serious political crises. And even those that aren't currently in political crises are not that far away from falling into one. Of course, the headline cases here are the region's two biggest countries, Sudan and Ethiopia. I'm sure we'll talk about the dynamics of their internal turmoil momentarily. Ethiopia is, to me, really quite concerning at the moment, given intractable insurgencies in both Oromia and Amhara region, the country's two biggest ethnic regions. And the Pretoria deal, at least in my view, is in a difficult state, given some of the internal disagreements within the TPLF, the fact that segments of sort of Tigrayan military forces are beginning to take sides in the particular in this particular factionalism within the TPLF. And then, of course, we could look at the situation in Somalia, which is at a bit of an inflection point, given the transition towards a more limited AU mission, the persistence and resilience of al-Shabaab, the fact that amidst all of that, disagreements between the federal government and federal member states continue. So I think a lot of issues there. One could talk about the situation in South Sudan. And then we have, two countries in the region, one not mentioned in the title of this program, Eritrea, and then Djibouti, which on its face seem not to be suffering from the kinds of internal turmoil that we see in other parts of the region. But in both of those contexts, you've got sort of highly personalized political systems, aging leaders, and no one really has any idea in either context what succession actually looks like. So perhaps trouble on the horizon there. All of those internal crises then I think feed into and reinforce some pretty serious interstate disputes across the region. One could talk about the situation between Ethiopia and Somalia over the MOU, which that situation I think has been de-escalated, but I think there are going to be lingering effects in terms of the bilateral relationship between Mogadishu and Addis. Eritrea-Ethiopia tensions are something that not a lot of folks are paying attention to, but probably should. And one could sort of go on down the list. And then just a few other things to flag, right? On top of the internal crises of these states, state interventions from Middle Eastern states, which I think are ratcheting up regional tension. That's an older story. Great power maneuvering and competition. I think the role of Russia is really an interesting story that has sort of revealed itself in recent years. Spillover relatedly from the war in Yemen, I think is quite significant, and then a whole array of kind of environmental, demographic, macroeconomic crises that are really stressing the region. And then finally, amidst all of these intersecting challenges, a real absence, I think, of regional responses from regional multilaterals, key states. So again, one doesn't like to be gloomy, but the region's, I think, in a very difficult situation.
Thank you. Next, Lauren, it's too early to tell what the Trump administration is going to do, but could you tell us what has been driving recent U.S. policy in the region, and what has Congress been prodding the government to do?
Sure. I mean, a lot of what is driving U.S. interest in the region and U.S. engagement in the region has existed over decades, 2 decades at least. Longstanding U.S. national security interests in the region related to freedom of navigation through the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, which is one of the world's busiest shipping routes. You've got, obviously, the only U.S. permanent military installation in Africa that the United States has put there in Djibouti, right there on the sort of connecting point between the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden at the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. And that installation, of course, remember, grew out of U.S. military engagement against al-Qaeda elements in Somalia, and has evolved over the years and maintains that presence both to support U.S. counterterrorism operations in Somalia and in the broader region, and to support other aims. It's a facility used not only by U.S. Africa Command, but by other commands, including CENTCOM. The counterterrorism interest obviously has not gone away. Al-Shabaab is currently described by U.S. officials as the wealthiest, largest, and most lethal of al-Qaeda's affiliates. We saw just a week or two ago a recent U.S. military strike on ISIS elements in Somalia. You may recall that there were some notable strikes and operations, including ground operations under the Biden administration against ISIS elements. The ISIS cell in Somalia, while small numerically, is believed by U.S. officials to be sort of a major hub financially and in terms of flow of fighters and logistics support for the ISIS global network. Other national security interests are regional stability, and those are tied again to those interests that I mentioned. Access is a longstanding U.S. interest. I mentioned the U.S. military base in in Djibouti. That base supports, when needed, evacuation operations like we saw in 2023 when we had to evacuate the United States Embassy from Khartoum. And of course, access is a broader thing than just having that base in Djibouti. The US needs to maintain good relations with some of the countries in the region, most notably Ethiopia, which is a large landmass, for overflight reasons. Again, that evacuation from Sudan required overflight of US military planes over Ethiopia to Djibouti to get US government personnel out. You have longstanding U.S. humanitarian and human rights concerns in the region. We've seen those largely maintained over administrations. Very large U.S. humanitarian investments in the region based on chronic and persistent and conflict-driven humanitarian concerns, humanitarian emergencies in Ethiopia, in Sudan, in South Sudan, in Somalia. The United States in recent years, as a result of the conflicts in Ethiopia and Sudan, had been providing over $1 billion a year. Those investments, as we'll probably talk about a bit more, are now somewhat in question in light of the U.S. or the new Trump administration's decision to freeze and review foreign aid. There has been a growing emphasis in recent administrations on expanding opportunities for U.S. trade and investment on the continent, seeing it as a sort of opportunity in terms of global markets, in terms of critical minerals. Of course, that focus has been really sort of more I think, prominent in Central Africa, but it is also there in East Africa in competition with China. You'll note that the United States has been extremely supportive of the U.S. the relationship between Ethiopia and the U.S. company Boeing. Ethiopian Airlines is a major purchaser of Boeing Airlines, and obviously they are the biggest airline on the continent. So those are some of the interests, of course, on the global stage. The U.S. is interested in, no doubt, sort of maintaining good relations with countries in the region. Somalia has just joined the UN Security Council, and an East African candidate is set to be, we don't know which one yet, the next chairman of the African Union Commission. So it's a region that sort of on a global stage, the United States is also sort of interested in from a diplomatic perspective.
Thank you, Lauren. Now next to Majdi. Majdi, as an economist and an investor in the region, what do you assess are the economic trend lines? And if I can add, what do you think will be the impact of the U.S. freeze on humanitarian and development assistance to the region?
Thank you, EJ and Atlantic Council, Ambassador, for the invitation. It's a great question, especially given the concerns raised by some of the other panelists. Just to be clear, we're not investing in Sudan at the moment. We do require a little bit more instability, but we're very, very bullish on Africa as a whole, which has about 10 of the top 20 fastest growing economies in the world. East Africa, which is the fastest growing part of Africa, I think 5.7% growth for 2024 and expected to be increasing. And within East Africa, we're very interested and focused and investing in Tanzania, Rwanda, Uganda, and in Ethiopia. Ethiopia just had the managing director of the IMF visit, commemorating some of the very substantial reforms that they've done, freeing the currency, opening up key sectors, generally a very strong trend line in terms of managing or reforming things that we had been working on for decades. Really, it was at the World Bank and IFC were interested to see these reforms, and they're happening now. Somalia, actually, despite the challenges from al-Shabaab, is actually also performing quite well on its reform program. Somaliland, that part of signed the MOU, is also growing as an investment destination, and Djibouti is also doing well. So there are regional tensions and stability, but that region does manage to grow. And the broader region, the dynamics are quite clear. It's the demographics. Africa will have a quarter of the world's population. The majority of working age new youth that come into the working age population are in Africa. The region's digitizing very quickly. I think AI is being more democratized, so that sort of big hurdle of potential sort of two-speed global economy is being addressed. So we like the region. We think there are great opportunities. Obviously, we'll have to wait for Sudan. And there, we can talk a little bit about the kinds of things that we'd like to see in terms of investment. But you asked about the U.S. pullout. Now, you and I were there when we were going through the reform process and were about to receive a lot of funding when the coup happened as a government. And the impact of the U.S. withdrawal, I think it's already it's not too early to start talking about the post-war dispensation and what happens with the massive reconstruction cost. We had estimated that something between 10 and 15 billion would be required on reconstruction and the economic support and humanitarian support. So it's a substantial amount. And when we were working in the government, I was sort of seconded to the Ministry of Finance. We craft a narrative based on what we were trying to do, is obviously born of the revolution and moving toward a transition to democracy and stability. And that narrative, in a way, kind of signals the kinds of economic support and who would be interested in providing the economic support. When the U.S. is out of the game, those who are trying to advocate for that narrative are substantially weakened. And there are plenty of sources of capital who are not interested in anything like that, who may be interested in a military regime or a corrupt regime where their resources, the substantial critical minerals, port, agriculture, and other resources of the region would be exploited more easily through paying officials, an Islamist regime, or any other sort of. The people of Sudan don't want those regimes. I mean, they've demonstrated it time and time again. But the U.S. disengagement doesn't help the prospects of the kind of regime that the people of Sudan and obviously the people of the United States would rather see, and many other actors. It's not so much only the financial investment, but the signal and the mobilization, which you were engaged in and many others were engaged in, to try to make sure that that would be the kind of outcome aligned with what the interests and why the people overthrew the regime in the first place. So I see the prospects now that we need to start thinking about as SAF starts to gain the upper hand, and as we can debate whether this is a near-term or a long-term prospect. But if we were today talking about reconstruction efforts and the U.S. was not in the game, I don't think that's very healthy for the region or for Sudan.
Thank you. Now to Alan on the screen. Alan, you're based in Nairobi. What is the regional perspective? And as Michael mentioned, the Red Sea has become a major theater of competition on both sides of its shores. How is the jockeying for ports and influence on the Red Sea and in the Indian Ocean driving conflict in the Horn? You're on mute, Alan. Alan, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thanks, EJ. Thanks, Atlantic Council. As Michael was outlining there, and Lauren and Machi also said, there's a few things going on here. First of all, the region itself is in great flux, as Michael outlined. So you have all the number of the countries in not only great crisis, but almost existential crises and often great conflict. But then on top of that, you have quite a lot of major jockeying from powers, especially off the continent, either middle powers or great powers who are jockeying for influence. And all of that's taking place in what appears to most in the region like a breakdown of any sort of order, or, as European and African friends like to call it, a regional security architecture. Essentially, there are no guardrails, and there don't seem to be any rules in place. I'd say on the more regional side, in terms of especially external competition and in the Horn, there are two main ones. There's the Red Sea, which I'll get to in a second, but I don't want to pass over the ongoing dispute over the Nile waters, principally between Egypt and Ethiopia, that continues to drive especially Egyptian foreign policy in this region. And Egypt is a major actor with all of these countries. And that dispute, I think, will continue to arise, especially early in this new U.S. administration. But there is, I'd say, the most predominant dispute of late has been the jockeying over the Red Sea. And this has come in a number of ways. A lot of attention is, of course, on Yemen with the Houthi rebels. But on the other side, on the African side of the Red Sea, we've seen almost a free-for-all. Within the Horn, we've seen Ethiopia itself, which had Red Sea access when Eritrea was part of Ethiopia. We've had Prime Minister Abiy declare it a major priority to regain that access. That led to escalating tensions, which are still there with Eritrea, which I agree with Michael is a deeply worrying situation. And then it also led to the MOU with Somaliland, which was another route towards sea access. And we can discuss that more later, but that's caused a lot of internal regional disputes. But then you've also had a number of, it's also leading the foreign policy, I'd say, with a number of middle powers who are on the Red Sea. Egypt, again, this is very important for it. Saudi Arabia, very important. And then others who don't sit on the Red Sea, but who are trying to gain access to it. Among the great powers, Russia does not yet have a Red Sea port there. Of course, US, China, and France all do in Djibouti. But then also you have the UAE, perhaps most prominently. You have Qatar, you have Iran, you have Turkey, all of which are jockeying around for influence in this region as well. That has those alliances, and of course all those countries have their own very complex relations with each other, disputes with each other, alliances with each other, and those are being overlapped over on the Horn of Africa region. In Sudan, we've seen where the UAE is on one side of the war, and then a lot of these other countries are more or less, especially the ones who already have positions on the Red Sea, they're on the Sudanese army side of the war, the Port Sudan side of the war. We've seen some of this sort of overlapping come across when Ethiopia was pushing for Red Sea access as well. And so you have a worrying situation where you have internal regional dynamics and you have a lot of competition among these outside actors too. And this is in a context in which the US is pulling back a bit strategically. Europe is focused at home, and these middle powers, mostly from the Middle East, are ramping up, and they consider it their rightful domain. This is their near abroad for most of them, and they're getting very active. Just to say, this has put US policymakers in often a difficult situation in which they're dealing with Middle East powers, which they have close ties with, but on many other files, and those other files tend to predominate. So when they do raise some of these Horn of African issues, it doesn't tend to rise to the top of the pile list. Whereas for these Middle East powers, these are often very important files, which they consider very critical for national security. You're dealing with often these outside regional powers who are both mediators in these conflicts, but also meddling in these conflicts at the same time. So they're rising both in soft power and hard power, and sometimes both at the same time. It's created a very difficult, complex environment for diplomacy, which often, frankly, is no longer working in the region, partly as a result.
Thank you, Alan. Khulud, as a Sudanese, you and your family have been directly affected by the war in Sudan. What is your prognosis? Do you think the fighting will continue? Will it destabilize the region as it has before? And is there anything the US, other countries, or other international organizations can do?
Thanks, EJ. It's an important question. I think, history tells us that the trajectory of these kinds of wars in Sudan is around 20 years, and we're only in year 2, heading into year 3. So it seems like we have a long way to go in terms of getting any kind of resolution that will bring about some level of stability. And even if the war doesn't last 20 years, we have, unfortunately, a set of actors that have now mushroomed. We have, rather than 2 main belligerent actors what we started with in April of 2023, or 4 really, if you count the non-signatories to the peace agreement, we now have maybe a dozen, maybe more. And this makes it extremely difficult for outside actors to try and corral these groups together into some kind of mediation process, particularly if the sequencing is ceasefire first, then political agreement. Quite obviously, no armed actor who has realized that picking up a gun is the price of admission to a future political career is going to put down their gun until they know what that future political career looks like. And so at least some modicum of a sketching out of what the lay of the land will look like in the post-war political dispensation, I think, would need to precede any sort of serious or sincere attempt at a ceasefire. We haven't seen that thus far, not in the Jeddah talks that were led by the US and Saudi Arabia, not through the African Union or the Arab League or any of the different sort of mediation pathways that we have seen. The one that had, I'd say, the most success in terms of they were able to get somewhere was the Manama Agreement. And that makes sense when you consider that the Manama Agreement is effectively a security pact made by security officials. It's not a diplomatic foray. And but what we saw there again was that as soon as the Sudanese Armed Forces members signed and came back to Port Sudan, that agreement immediately disavowed. And so we have to think about, the non-armed actors that are obviously very clearly in positions of power here, particularly the Islamists of the Bashir era who have taken up sort of a different guise, but very much remain at the heart of things. And, and people say, will they come back? Is that what they're trying to do? They're already back. I think we can see that very clearly in the way that different actors, the Sudanese Armed Forces in particular, have been forced to conduct politics. And so, despite the recent, for example, remarks by the head of the Sudanese Armed Forces, General Burhan, about sort of this amnesty and extending the olive branch to different political actors that he spent the past 2 years effectively pillorying and threatening. That's going to fall on deaf ears. It's going to fall very flat because, of course, no one trusts this man. This is a man who led a coup alongside General Hemeti against civilian rule. And so actually neither Burhan nor Hemeti can really sketch out, and they haven't really done so, sketch out a pathway for civilian leadership and democratic leadership. And so very few actors, other than maybe the immediate, we need to end this war, so we'll pick one side or the other, but very few political actors, very few constituencies in Sudan can really rally behind these armed groups unless they have an ethnic affiliation with them or that they see that their ethnic interests would be somewhat addressed by these groups. So it leaves us in a position where a war that was started over control over resources, control over the different types of different levers of the state, etc., has now become, especially the economy, has now become much, much more ethnicized. And that kind of war is very intractable. So even if we see one entity, for example, the Sudanese Armed Forces, take the capital, Khartoum, that's not going to bring about an end to this war because there has been 2 years at least, and actually much longer than that, of incredible amounts of hate speech, incredible amount of racially based political mobilizing that unfortunately is trying to undo a lot of the good foundational aspects of peaceful coexistence and peaceful change that have been taking place during the revolutionary period and thereafter. So we are at an inflection point of sorts, but it seems like we'll just be entering a new phase of this war rather than really coming to an end of it.
Thank you, Khulud. And I should mention to the audience that obviously you are welcome to ask questions. I ask you to please submit them to askac.org. But I will ask another question in the meantime. Mike, you said the situation in the Horn is bleak, but arguably it's been worse in the past and it has changed. There were a remarkable few decades of relative peace and stability. What needs to happen to reverse the growing instability in the region? And should the U.S. play a major role? And if so, ideally, what should that do?
It's a big question. I mean, I think there are solutions to be had. I mean, I think we can imagine a way forward. There are probably a number of things that need to happen. I think one thing that we should put on the table is a sort of reinvigorated regional peace initiative. I mean, even as we have conflict-specific peace tracks, whether on Sudan, Pretoria in Ethiopia, efforts that were made by Turkey and others to de-escalate bilateral tensions between Somalia and Ethiopia, I think we need a region-wide conversation, one that's actually trans-regional, right, that brings the African side of the Red Sea and the Middle Eastern side of the Red Sea together to dialogue about the ways in which various conflicts across the region can be de-escalated And the de-escalation is really what we're talking about right now, not really their full resolution. And then also relatedly, how parties in the region can mobilize the necessary kind of security and financial commitments and guarantees to really incentivize peace across this region. Now, part of the reason I say that is because I think dealing with some of the region's fault lines on a kind of fault line by fault line basis is not fully going to work. It's got to be complemented by a regional approach, because the calculations of these various parties in one theater are shaped by their calculations in another. I mean, to give you, just one very quick example, you can't really understand Eritrea's engagement in Eastern Sudan, engagement with the South, without understanding the politics of its relationship with Ethiopia. You can't understand some of the bilateral tensions between Ethiopia and Somalia without understanding some of the tensions between Mogadishu and Jubaland, Mogadishu and Puntland. So I think we've got to take, even as we take conflict-specific tracks, we've got to develop, I think, a regional approach as well. Can the U.S. play a role? It should play a role. I think it's well positioned to, I'm hard pressed to think of another actor that has the capabilities or relationships necessary to kind of pushing forward this regional conversation. It's got relations with pretty much everyone in this region save Eritrea. But I think this is going to require a couple of different things, and this speaks to some of the issues that Alan raised. It's going to require a degree of commitment and priority over a sustained period of time that we haven't yet seen, honestly, from the U.S. government. It's going to take, again, to speak to one of Alan's points, a willingness to, at least on some level, center the question of Horn of Africa stability in dealings with the U.S.'s Middle Eastern partners, whether it's the UAE, the Saudis, Turkey. And then, I would be remiss if I didn't mention, I think kind of U.S. foreign policy is in a moment of flux. And traditionally, one lever, one mechanism for helping to promote regional stability that the U.S. has had is its humanitarian development governance-related assistance. And that we'll see what happens, but on some level, that might have been taken off the table in some ways. And so we're going to need to think about what other levers the U.S. has to kind of shape a stabilization pact across this particular region.
Thank you. Lauren, that tees you up. Do you agree with Michael? We don't know, obviously, what the Trump administration is going to do in the next 6 months, but you know Congress quite well. Do you think that they're going to continue to put pressure on his advisors and the State Department to stay engaged? And what do you think U.S. allies in the Middle East want the U.S. to do?
It's a great question, and obviously we are in an era of unpredictability at the moment, and I can't say anything authoritatively, and I certainly can't speak for Congress. We've had some changes in Congress, but if we look to the last Congress, there was quite a bit of activity, for example, on the conflict and the crisis in Sudan, a lot of bipartisan engagement, bipartisan pressure on the Biden administration to do more to end the war. At the very end of Congress, we saw legislation passed to require the next administration to appoint another special envoy for Sudan. How quickly the Trump administration will move on that is not yet clear. We don't have an Assistant Secretary of Africa nominated yet. So there are a lot of unknowns about where the Trump administration is going to go on this. Of course, there have been some rumors about possible appointees. In terms of congressional engagement on Sudan, let's go back to that because I think we've seen some signs of that continuing. There was both in the House and the Senate legislation that called what the Rapid Support Forces are doing in Darfur genocide, and we saw at the end of the Biden administration a decision to declare the RSF to be responsible for acts of genocide in Sudan. At the same time, the Biden administration also moved at the end of the administration to sanction General Burhan, and that has an impact on how this new administration can engage. There have been some expressions of support for those sanctions, but how that might sort of constrain U.S. diplomacy, we don't yet know. There were calls throughout the last Congress for sanctions on those supplying weapons and supporting and fueling the war. There were some calls from some members of Congress to stop arms sales to the United Arab Emirates over its reported links to the RSF. So I think we'll probably, we could expect that some of that congressional pressure will continue from members who are still in Congress. There has been congressional support for pushing the military leaders of Sudan towards transition to civilian rule and democracy. How the Trump administration will engage on that, we don't know. Turning to Ethiopia, longstanding congressional concerns about human rights abuses and the instability there. Whether that will continue in this administration, we don't know. Somalia, in the last Congress, we saw an effort, legislative effort that was not successful to have troops again withdrawn from Somalia. We don't know whether the Trump administration will revisit that decision that they made in the first Trump administration. There was also an effort by a Republican member of Congress at the end of the administration to call for the recognition of Somaliland. Whether or not the Trump administration will take that up, again, we don't know. So a lot of unknowns, but we can sort of pull out some lessons from what members of Congress who remain in Congress have done sort of in previous times.
Thank you, Lauren. Let me switch to Alan now. Alan, until recently, Ethiopia was arguably the regional anchor state. And as you've mentioned, it is now pitted in a series of conflictual and rival relationship with neighboring states. And it itself is fragile, given the civil war that occurred there just a few years ago. And I should add to that, one of the audience also asked a question about the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam and how that has increased tensions between Addis and Cairo. So what's your prognosis? I mean, is there a chance that regional conflict could break out with Ethiopia? And what would that mean for stability in the entire Horn?
Sure. The political sea change that we saw in Ethiopia with Abiy's rise has obviously been one of the major factors in all this flux that we're talking about within the region. As you said, Ethiopia for a long time, together with Kenya, had been an anchor state of regional stability. And now it fights. There's been conflict on numerous fronts. Obviously, the Tigray War, but there's still an ongoing insurgency in Oromia, quite a large insurgency in the major Amhara region. And yes, it has had this big dispute with Somalia, which the Turks recently did some mediation over, and perhaps that's dying down a bit, but it's not fully resolved. Yes, they have this ongoing, very bitter dispute with Egypt over the building of the Grand Renaissance Ethiopian Dam. I was just in Cairo last week, and I'll say that for the Egyptians, it's no longer about just that dam. It's also now about what they fear will be future dams by the Ethiopians and by the recent ratification by upstream countries of the Nile Basin Initiative, which it considers a threat. And then on top of all that, there's been very escalating tensions with Eritrea as well. Eritrea, of course, used to be part of Ethiopia, fought its long own insurgency and gained its own independence, then fell into a border war with Ethiopia. After that, there was a falling out amid allies, both in Addis and Asmara, and then they fought this border war. And then they were, they had very bitter relations. But then when Abiy came to power, they teamed up against the Tigrayan political elite, against Tigray in a war of common cause. And then when that war ended, by Abiy's choice, not President Isaias Afwerki's choice of Eritrea, then we had another falling out. And we at Crisis Group are very worried about the chance of an Ethiopian-Eritrea civil war. I think it is the sort of sleeping giant of all the crises. Obviously, the war in Sudan is the very big one, and people can see other crises percolating, but there is a very negative feedback loop, even an expectation, I would say, by many in the region, possibly even including in Asmara, that there will be a conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea in the coming years. We've seen what that looks like before. It was very, very deadly in the end of the 1990s. However, that was a time when that war didn't merge with other regional wars, when we didn't have all these outside Middle Eastern powers also involved. It
Alan?
like it did back then. Yeah.
Nope, sorry, we just cut off for a sec. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, just to say, if this broke out now, we could see it merge with the war in Sudan if it's still going on, and we would undoubtedly see a proxy war among allied Middle Eastern powers over this as well. It could destabilize not just the region, but the Red Sea as well. It's a very worrying possibility.
Thank you, Alan. That's a great tee-off for my next question to Khulud. Khulud, as Michael and Alan described, Sudan and other countries in the Horn are the scenes of intense Middle Eastern competition for influence. You've spent time looking at these countries. Why is this the case? And why can these governments that know each other relatively well not find a more cooperative arrangement for dealing with this region?
I think there's undoubtedly a scramble for the Horn going on, and you have particularly the Gulfies fighting over sort of one element of it, and then the Egyptians fighting over a different element of it. Effectively, you can really think about it as the war of the two waters, the Red Sea and the Nile. And because they both impact the Horn, there is now this intense competition that seems to be a zero-sum game. And so Egypt and Ethiopia sort of trying to fight over this, and Sudan is very much caught in the middle, both territorially and politically. And then you have the Saudis and the Emiratis fighting over sort of Red Sea access. This is obviously very simplified, but just to sort of land the point here, that control over these waters is very important for the economic sort of futures of these countries. But beyond that, we also have to situate what's going on within the sort of broader, potentially global trajectory towards de-dollarization. A lot of these countries are quite anxious about, particularly the Saudis, and in particular, I would say the Emiratis, are quite anxious about the idea that they would be caught off guard if the sort of world economy were to de-dollarize, with the BRICS countries really pushing for an alternative currency. And what we're seeing is both, the Saudis and the Emiratis, the Egyptians and the Ethiopians are all joining BRICS, or in the process of joining BRICS, to try and stave off the impact of what that looks like. And in order to sort of backstop a currency or be able to keep your own financial transactions afloat, if there is a new currency, traditionally we have seen countries, particularly those with imperial ambitions, and I would say that all of the countries I just mentioned do have imperial ambitions, in particular the UAE. It's a very sort of Britannic style of imperialism, where a small country wants to invest, wants to have territorial a grasp in many parts of the world, and particularly in its near abroad, in order to maintain those imperial ambitions. But you're looking at things like land, you're looking at things like extractives, particularly gold, you're looking at things like strategic real estate, such as ports, you're looking at things like oil, and you're looking at AI and data. Those tend to be the five big sort of resources, if you will, that tend to backstop a currency, or have in the past backstopped a currency. And we can see all of those play a role in the competitions between particularly the Emiratis and the Saudis, but also, of course, the Egyptians and the Ethiopians. But I would say when it comes to Egypt, Ethiopia, it is much more about, as Alan said, it's not about the GERD. The GERD is pretty much done. It's about Egypt's anxiety about what happens next. There may be other GERDs, and they need to be very careful about how to, basically address and make sure they have as much as economic, but also political investment there and security there as possible. Sudan, unfortunately, lies as a sort of political football within all of these competitions because of how weak it is internally, even with, or rather because of, successive military governments that haven't been able to get full buy-in from their own populations. They've sought to seek that from abroad. They've sought to get security guarantees from abroad, and that has made them actually even more weak, as we've seen. one of the possible scenarios that we are seeing is a split within the country, and seemingly every day that becomes more and more likely. What a split does effectively is internally give both SAF and the RSF a win. They both get to say, we now claim this territory that we control, even though both of them, particularly the RSF, will have such little control of that territory. The RSF were not designed to govern. They were designed to run rampage, which they are currently doing. But what it will also do is give these countries and sort of their own little fiefdoms with which to control their search for their own interests. And that is the difficulty here, that whatever we would like to see, whatever the US would like to see, the unity of Sudan, the sort of stability of Sudan are not going to be guaranteed by these regional actors, which are, after all, US allies, because this type of competition that they have is so, sort of so much against civilian rule, so much against democratic rule, so much against the unity of the Sudan as we're looking at it. And what this means is that, the US, for example, needs to really look at some like-mindeds. US allies are not like-minded when it comes to Sudan. I think that needs to be something that Washington really needs to assess and get a hold of if it wants to play a role, and this is still, of course, up for debate, but if it wants to play a role in the resolution of this conflict and more broadly in the Horn.
Thank you. Pulling back a little bit and turning back to Alan again. Alan, you talked about Russian interest in ports in the Red Sea. Obviously, we've talked a lot about Middle Eastern interest, but what about China? I mean, China used to be a major actor in the region. Is it still? What role is it playing at the moment?
Thanks. China's main anchor in the Horn is, of course, its military base in Djibouti. We haven't seen China step up in the way many predicted it might in terms of political and conflict mediation. It is a major investor, obviously, but we have seen it sort of pull back. It was very involved in Sudan and South Sudan in the past. We've seen it pull back a bit. It's a major investor in Ethiopia that remains true, but it did not get very involved as a mediating force. It's obviously China's been obviously very concerned, especially with the dynamics amid the Red Sea. But I think the complexity of the crises here and the number of outside actors who are competing and jostling with each other has made a challenge for China to figure out exactly what to do. And it hasn't been willing to use leverage and put leverage on the table, I think, in the same way that the US occasionally has. So there have been some initiatives from China. There was an attempt to sort of have a Horn of Africa a meeting in which they invited foreign ministers from around, and in general, it basically maybe not flopped because it never got to the point where it could flop, but it never led to anything. And the sense is that they're still trying to see if there is an opportunity, but they haven't jumped in the political and security space like many expected might happen.
Thanks, Alan. Majdi, you've painted a kind of a mixed bag or mixed scene of what's happening in the Horn, right? So obviously, a lot of growing political and security instability, but you've also noted that there's been pretty substantial economic growth. You yourself invest in certain regions. So, what would you tell a Trump if you were, to be asked? There's obviously lots of rare earth minerals and all these other things that the president and the administration is very interested in the Horn of Africa. I mean, where are the pockets of investment opportunities that should drive U.S. and Western interest?
So it's a search to find. Question sort of goes to how do you find pockets of potential wins in such a complex environment? So a lot of the economic issues and the underlying the political issues and the underlying economic issues are currently framed as zero sum. So if you were somebody who's a deal maker, you would try to change these to more positive sum games, because frankly, if you look at the issue of Nile waters, cooperative management where the right signals can be sent upstream and the right sort of flows of water and other resources can be made to benefit both Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. I mean, this is frankly the dam is a very big positive for Sudan in terms of how it manages its agriculture. The same can be true for Egypt. One would look for trying to create a level of understanding across how a more cooperative approach on some of these issues. The Red Sea is the same. An economically vibrant Ethiopia and Somalia, Sudan, Djibouti, et cetera, will require more traffic, will send more logistics volume to the ports that get built. And you're talking about 6-7% growth across the region, there will be more volume. And so one should think about how do we de-escalate, and sort of in terms of actors, regional actors, in addition to the US having relationships with most of them in a positive way, I would also look at Turkey. So Turkey has a strong and positive relationship with Ethiopia, with Somalia, with the UAE, not necessarily the RSF, but clearly with the backer, one of the backers of the RSF. I think that they could clearly see a more positive sum vision for the region. I would sort of work with them, try to understand, actually work across the region. I think you need to have a more inclusive dialogue that includes all of the region, but also certainly the Sudanese themselves. And within Sudan and within the region as a whole, I like moving away from the state level. I think young people in the region. And we already talked about the demographics of Africa. But if you look at the youth of Sudan, who somehow, despite decades of fairly bleak economic prospects, very close political space, took on the regime and won in 2019, and then since then have been the major source of support for local people in terms of emergency response rooms. 57 of them at last count, the last number I've seen, have been killed in the conflict. So it's a quite difficult role that they play. And other Sudanese in the diaspora backing them and providing support where perhaps the state hasn't been able to really channel resources at the local level, or other states, development actors. But across the region, I see the same thing. Despite the state really failing to provide the kind of health, education, job opportunities in the region, I see young people taking up, becoming entrepreneurs and providing some of those, filling those gaps with solutions. And so I would look at them as much more positive actors in the sense of, Africa as a whole only gets 1% of global venture funding. East Africa, there's a few big countries that get a fair amount, but most of the countries we're speaking to don't get, next to any. And so when I looked at Tanzania and Rwanda, Uganda, places that were growing and relatively stable, it's a clear, very important investment opportunity we should be thinking about. And Africa really, facing this moment, is really looking at, look, maybe we need to shift from aid to building from the bottom up and taking control of our own, having more agency in how development happens, much more African solutions. A lot of the youth that I speak to and back have been abroad and have come back. They're world class in terms of education. And I see that as an opportunity. So I would look at more trade and more investment at the local level in terms of entrepreneurs. I would look at trying to find win-win solutions and working with a cross-section. I think Turkey has a particularly interesting role that we haven't seen fully play out, but it could be in terms of finding the win-wins across some of these fault lines that I think the U.S. can build on, if not directly engage itself.
No, thank you, Majdi. I mean, I have to certainly agree with you that I've met some incredibly impressive people in my travels, not just in Sudan, but in the Horn, and certainly there is everything there for the region to take off. Unfortunately, in my view, the region is cursed to a certain degree by these rivalries from outside actors that are destabilizing certain countries, and that's destabilizing the region.
Maybe I don't want to interrupt you, but it's true, but this is long-standing, and it's decades long-standing, and somehow there are people who respond to trauma and difficulty and challenges by backing out and giving up. But what we've seen in the region is that that's not the case. Somehow, they've responded by becoming more active, more resilient, some way more altruistic, and hopefully that will continue to be the case.
Thank you for pushing back on that. Don't disagree at all. I guess I was just trying to tee up a last question for Michael. We do obviously have a coordination problem, right? We have all these different actors trying to influence the situation in the Horn. They're obviously destabilizing the region. I should add to that there certainly is no loss of agency, that there are lots and lots of political entrepreneurs in the region that are using these different rivals to further their own agendas. But it does sound like there needs to be something to kind of try to coordinate all these different actors around a better, not a suboptimal outcome, right? And obviously here in Washington, D.C., we frequently talk about the need for a special envoy that can kind of help corral all the actors that are trying to act in the region. So, I mean, in your view, do you think the U.S. should appoint a new envoy for Sudan? If not Sudan, for the Horn or for the Red Sea? And do you think that would be helpful? Or should the U.S. stay out for the moment because it isn't very serious?
It's a good question. I mean, I think it's certainly something that should be considered, right? Whether you have a new special envoy for Sudan or for the Horn / Red Sea. Those envoys, particularly the Horn envoy, did have some wins, right? I mean, it played a pretty critical role in pushing the Pretoria deal in October, November 2022, in conjunction with the AU.
Which ended the fighting between Ethiopia and Eritrea.
Precisely. Yes.
Yeah, sorry.
Yes. Eritrea was involved, but yeah, and ended the conflict in the Tigray region. Now, the reason I'm hedging is because I think if you're going to appoint special envoys for these files, I think experience has shown those special envoys' offices need to be structured in the right way. And so, they need resources, proper staffing. They need the ability to engage not just in the Horn, but also on the Middle Eastern side of the Red Sea. They need lines of connection and communication with top levels of the State Department, the White House, to be able to mobilize the U.S. government. I mean, you just don't want them on an island doing their thing without the kind of senior level support that's necessary. So in theory, I think it could be helpful. It needs, I think, the structure of that effort needs some attention.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thank you, all the panelists, and apologies for misstating the civil war in Ethiopia. I hope this was of interest to the audience, and please do keep track of your emails and invitations from the Africa Center. We do hope to have these kinds of discussions in the future to help inform your thinking and our thinking about what is happening in an important continent, and one where we believe the future is hopefully bright. Thank you.